No matter what you think of Jone Jones, he's the fucking best ever, and he's the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world. And he's the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world.
Yeah. You are without the faculty of critical thought. You are without the perception of sight. You may just be without sensory observation on any level if you so much as insinuate that any fighter not named Johnny Bones Jones is the #1 MMA combatant on the face of the planet. It would sound a bit like I'm Dana White at a post-fight press conference arguing with some media member over who is the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the UFC. Dana would suggest to you that this individual is indubitably, without question, Jone Jones. I, however, disagree. I think there is much to question in that claim. If Dana were to instead suggest that Jones is the greatest of all time, I would be less fervent in my rejection of that claim. And that is because it is founded on rationale. There is logic to support it. There is a lot of concrete evidence on which you can base that claim. What you do not have a litany of evidence, however, is to suggest that Jone Jones is unquestionably the pound-for-pound #1 fighter currently. And that's the important distinction between these two recognitions. The GOAT is the fighter who throughout their career has the greatest list of accomplishments. The pound-for-pound #1 is which fighter currently is most dominant in his weight division, because that gives you the best idea of who can span the greatest weight radius of opponents and be the most successful, which is in theory who should be the pound-for-pound #1. If you were to suggest that that person is unquestionably Jone Jones, I got news for you. That can be debated, and that can be debated with concrete evidence. All right? Just to give you a little bit of an idea, we should look at some of Jones' opponents on the pound-for-pound list. Currently, one notable opponent that he has would be Alex Poatan Pereira. Let's consider current to be as distant as 2 years ago. I would even argue that that is conservative. That is, we could go back further and consider those fights as current representations of the fighter's ability. But for concreteness and not to consider too many fights for active fighters, we can go back 2 years and consider that to be the fights that have happened within the past 2 years to be fights that are worthy of consideration for their current abilities. So Alex Pereira, in some of his last fights, most recently Khalil Roundtree Jr., a strong victory against a resilient opponent. There may have been questions as to the actual skill level of Khalil due to the fact that was number 8 in the rankings when he faced Pereira. You cannot, however, argue with his heart. A heart of gold, a very persistent fighter, did not give up on himself, and also a strong representation of the Muay Thai style, as we know from Joe Rogan. Another win of Alex Pereira over a former champion, Yuri Prohaska. A samurai warrior, a man committed to honor, dedication, a man who lives a life of discipline. A strong fighter, certainly. A win over Jamal Hill for Alex Pereira as well, another former champion. He has wins over Jan Blachowicz in the last 2 years. A win over Israel Adesanya, one of the greatest middleweights of all time. All in the past 2 years. Alex Pereira wins over 4 champions in the past 2 years. A strong resume. Certainly a competitor for the pound-for-pound #1 spot. Another relevant person to consider for the pound-for-pound #1 spot, bantamweight Merab Dvalishvili. All right, the #1 source of testicular trauma in the bantamweight division. May his wrestling heavy style be a little bit unflattering to some. Certainly, but you cannot deny his dominance as a fighter. I do not care if he is not submitting people, if he is not knocking them out. He is physically incapacitating his opponents because of his pace. If you are able to completely shut down the game plan of your opponent, I do not care the manner in which you are accomplishing this. It could be the least aesthetically appealing thing to watch since we watched paint dry. You get the idea. If you are doing what he is doing to his opponents and the quality of opponents, you are a dominant fighter. In the past 2 years, he has wins over Jose Aldo, Peter Yan, Henry Cejudo, and Sean O'Malley. That is one of the most dominant strings of wins that you could have imaginable in the UFC today. Another person, another candidate for pound number one would be Ilia Topuria. One of the most cerebral strikers I have ever seen. The man's shots, not just shots, every movement he makes inside the cage is deliberate. This is a man who dominantly defeated Alex Volkanovski. And Alex Volkanovski himself was the man who taught Max Holloway, the man with the most significant strikes landed in the UFC, that brawling is not the same as boxing. He made Holloway's striking look rudimentary, and then Ilia Topuria made the striking of Volkanovski look obsolete. That is how you can tell the striking abilities of Ilia Topuria. In the past 2 years, he has wins over Max Holloway, Alexander Volkanovski, and Joshua Emmett, all in extremely dominant fashion. He also has a win over Bryce Mitchell, which should be considered as well. Now, if you're thinking, well, these fighters are all in different weight divisions, they're, or maybe you think, oh, just three. Well, it's not even that bad, because Jone Jones is not even unquestionably the most dominant fighter in his own weight division. Because within his weight division lies a colossus, a mammoth of a man, an unquestionably dominant competitor, Tom Aspinall from the United Kingdom. In the past 2 years, wins over Volkov, Curtis Blades, Marcin Tybura, Sergey Pavlovich, all in incredibly dominant fashion. Knockouts or a submission within the first minute and a half, or I guess for Volkov it was longer than, but first round at worst. Best case scenario for the majority of these fights, wins within virtually the first minute. I do not know of a more dominant run since legitimately Ronda Rousey is the only other person in UFC history with wins so quickly over opponents that are even somewhat legitimate. And I would argue that the opponents of Thomas Aspinall are considerably stronger than the opponents she faced. So now, with those individuals out of the way, if Dana is suggesting that Jone Jones is unquestionably the pound-for-pound number one fighter, surely his resume in the past 2 years is something to write home about. Surely I should be amazed. Surely I should have to avert my eyes as I try to take a glance at the list of opponents he's beat in the past 2 years. This should be defeats worthy of praise by any fighter in the history of the planet. And yet, when I look at the resume of Jone Jones over the past 2 years, I'm looking at Ciryl Gane and Stipe Miocic, a 42-year-old man at the time of the fight. What is that? I will give it to Jones. The defeat of Ciryl Gane was impressive. However, his most recent performance against Stipe Miocic was not worthy of the praise that it is receiving. Stipe was completely an old man. Okay? Stipe looked as if he was concocted to justify the definition of telegraph for which we use to describe shots which one can easily anticipate. It looked like he was reaching into his back pocket, pulling out a telegraph, writing to Jone Jones a few states over, and pressing send that a right hand was incoming. Jones has all week to respond and get out of the way. And then the right hand comes, okay? Stipe was slower than molasses, moving backwards uphill without the moon. This man was not quick whatsoever. While the spinning back kick, yes, it was a nice technique. The execution of the move was good. But guess what? He did it against a man who was hardly moving. This win is not worthy of incredible praise. Moreover, if we look at the past 2 years, in contrast to the 4 other fighters of the UFC that we just ran through, Jones has 2 wins. 2 wins. Even if they were incredible wins against remarkable opponents, 2 wins in the past 2 years would be nearly insufficient evidence to suggest that he's pound for pound number one currently. Moreover, it is nowhere near enough evidence to suggest that he is, without question, the pound-for-pound number one fighter. And yet, Dana will sit here and tell you that it is unreasonable to even consider anyone else as the pound-for-pound number one. And because he cannot see how anyone can interpret the pound-for-pound number one fighter to be anyone but Jone Jones, he says that we need to completely remodel the fashion in which the pound-for-pound rankings are assembled. And that is, Dana says, these media members that vote on the pound-for-pound list, they just don't know what they're watching. These media members that have covered the sport for decades, they just don't know what constitutes a great performance. They don't know what makes a great fighter. They don't know the relevant skill set that they need to consider when voting on this list. Instead, we need to get artificial intelligence, AI, to assemble these rankings. I got news for you, Dana. If you get AI trained in any reasonable fashion, any reasonably trained AI model, or if it's trained on any reasonable data set, it is going to give you rankings in which Jone Jones is lower than he is currently. Jone Jones would be lucky to be in the number 2 spot if an artificial intelligence model, like I said, is reasonably trained, and that is what is used to do the rankings. He would be lucky to be number 2. Dana does not want artificial intelligence to do the rankings. He wants a guise under which he can justify his illegitimate claim that Jones is number 1. He wants rankings that align perfectly with what he is, erroneously spewing to his audience so that he can promote fights and increase the revenue of the UFC. That's the truth. He is trying to propagate lies so that the UFC can benefit. And understandably so. He's a businessman. It's an intelligent decision. But why does he have to act as if it is, the fact that he has to act as if it is unquestionable that Jones is number 1 is so egregiously incorrect. Yeah, and he wants to reach out to Mark Zuckerberg. Let's get this AI deal done ASAP. Zuck would have to, Facebook, Meta AI, they're going to have to make an AI model that is, so unreasonably trained, or, it's going to have to be illogical criteria to have Jones as number 1 in the pound-for-pound list. And I didn't even go over the fact that Islam Makhachev would also be a worthy competitor, or a worthy nomination for the number 1. In fact, he is a number 1. So, perhaps this is an overreaction as to the extreme incorrect take of Dana. But certainly I think it's fair to say that there is much to question in the claim that Jones is the pound-for-pound number 1. And AI rankings is not going to resolve the issue.